I'm making Returner a Metroidvania game where you can possess enemies and use their abilities for combat and traversal. I spent a huge part of the last month polishing my player movement, and I think it's coming along quite well. In this update, I'll show you some of the improvements I've made and I'll appreciate your feedback on them. Okay, first of all, the biggest discovery I made while working on the player movement is how much smooth movement depends on the animation. No matter how good your gray box is, it's very difficult to capture weight and timing without proper animation. So if there's any advice I'll give you, it's to make sure your art, or at least a close version of your art, is ready before you start polishing your player movement. Now to the updates. The goal for my player movement is simple: make it smooth and responsive. I really hate it when I play games and it feels like I'm fighting the controls or I'm stuck on an action that I can't cancel while I watch my player get mauled by the enemy. Like many other 2D games, my player has two major kinds of movements: running and jumping. Players will spend most of their time shuffling between these two actions. Let's start with running. On the surface, running is simple. You move from left to right, from right to left, you get it now. But the question is, how do I make it responsive while giving it a sense of weight? The answer is actually very simple. You can do it with smooth transitions. Initially, for my player character, I had just one running state. Everything happens on the same note, no variations in movement, and it really made the movement feel very stiff. After some updates, my player character now has various movement states. It has the turning state when the player changes direction. It has the moving state, which means its X velocity is greater than 0. It also has the wall leap state, which is a quality of life improvement that makes running much more responsive. When the player changes direction, we move the player to a turning state. It plays a turn animation before playing the running animation. The problem with that is, if you keep the player's velocity at 0 at that point while the animation is playing, that slight delay messes up with the game's responsiveness. On the other hand, moving the player at full speed while in the turning state also makes it look like the player is sliding. So what I did was to change the player's acceleration depending on the previous state. For example, if the player turns to another direction from the idle state, we slowly ramp up the player's move speed while turning, since they are starting from 0 velocity. But what if the player turns into another direction suddenly while running? For a very brief moment, they maintain velocity in that direction while playing the turning animation before finally ramping up their speed in the direction they turn to. But there is a caveat here. To stop the player from sliding left and right while turning, they have to have been running for a little while, so there is a check for how long the player has been running to determine if there should be a slide or not. Also, if the player simply stops without turning, their velocity goes to 0 immediately, there is no slide. This variety in movements gives a better balance between weight and responsiveness. For the wall leap movements, I actually took the inspiration from Silksong. For the variety and verticality of level designs, sometimes there are little elevations that require a short jump to climb. So I added a feature that allows the player to automatically scale these walls while running without losing momentum. It's one of those things that doesn't really matter, but adds a bit of fun and responsiveness in the right places. The effect of having these subtle transitions is that I also have to add animations that match. For example, turning while fully running has a slightly different animation from turning from a stop position. It's a lot of work, but I think it makes the game better. Now let's talk about jumping. I think getting the jump to feel just right is even much more difficult than getting the running to feel right. The amount of small tweaks I've had to make to stop the player from feeling floaty or too heavy is insane. And even now, I'm not really sure it's there yet, or at least until I get more people to try it out. Over the course of a player simply jumping, there are a lot of small adjustments made on the fly to make the jumping precise and controllable. I'll list some of them here. First of all, I kind of cheat on the gravity a little bit. The gravity applied on the player while falling is less than the gravity applied on the player while jumping. This is based on the assumption that when jumping, players will want to reach the peak quicker, maybe to hit a target or to do something else. And when falling, players need to precisely direct their character to a safe point, hence the lower gravity. What this means is that when the player is falling, they have more time on their hands to safely position their character. In addition to this, I have a variable called fall move multiplier, which slightly increases the player's X move speed while falling, making it easier for players to react in tight situations. It's a slight increase in movement speed, but it makes a huge difference. Also, for maximum responsiveness, the player's Y velocity gets to a max immediately the jump button is pressed. This means takeoff is instant, there is no ramp up. On the other hand, the player's fall velocity is ramped up to give the player a bit of hang time at the top. To control the players from progressively falling faster, the player's fall velocity is capped. After falling for a while, at some point, their velocity no longer increases. All these tweaks happen constantly while the player is jumping without them even noticing, which is actually a good thing, since the outcome is having a jump that doesn't frustrate the player. There are other standard features like coyote time, input buffering for jumps that I added that I won't bother to go over in this video since it's already been discussed to death at this point. Now let's talk about ledge climbing. It sounds simple, but I think it's a very important part of my movement system, which I'm going to explain why right now. It's one of those things that gave me the most headaches. It was just very difficult to get seats to consistently detect ledges and to work without interrupting movement flow. I really wanted a system where when the player is on the run and they encounter a ledge, they can just ledge climb and then keep the momentum going without having to stop like some other games do. It was even harder to get the animations to match with the movement, but I eventually solved it with a bunch of raycast and shapecast checks when the player is in the air. When jumping or falling, or in other words, in air, the game constantly checks if the player is on a ledge, and I do this with 2 shapecasts and 2 raycasts. Let me explain how. I have a shapecast in front of the player's head that checks if a wall is above the player. If a wall is above the player, then it simply means there is nothing for the player to grab. I then have another shapecast that is around the player's chest that also checks if a wall is in front of the player. Basically, what this does is to check if there is a wall in front of the player above the player's chest that doesn't extend upwards above the player's head. If this is the case, we assume there is a wall. That's the first round of checks. The next check is to check if the player is on the floor. It really doesn't make sense for the player to ledge climb by pushing forward while on the floor. Or maybe it does, I don't know. But if the player is not on the floor, we do a final check to store the Y position of the floor the player is to climb to with a raycast that extends from the top to the bottom in front of the player, checking for flaws. Once all these checks are done, a combination of the results determines if the player is on a climbable ledge or not. But we are still not done. You see, ledge climb is an action that has to be done intentionally. Initially, I had a fully automated ledge climb system that immediately moves the player on top of the ledge once the ledge is detected. But that proved to be too interruptive, especially during combat. So the new system first checks if the player is on a ledge, and then checks if the forward direction is held before attempting a ledge climb. If these two conditions are met, the ledge grab occurs and will move the player to the Y position of the floor above we stored earlier while playing the matching ledge climb animation. But wait, it still doesn't end there. In many games, after a ledge grab, the player goes into an idle state, which means their X velocity becomes 0. This is mostly because the game is setting the player's position to the new floor point at that stage, and cancelling it might cause the player character to get stuck on a wall. And to be honest, it's not really a bad idea, but I think it can be improved. So what I did was, for maximum responsiveness, I took it a step further in my game by adding 2 things. The first one is the ability to cancel a ledge climb with a jump, and the second one is impulse buffering to keep the player momentum immediately after ledge climbing. When the player is ledge climbing, if the jump button is pressed within the right window, it turns to a sort of wall jump where the player jumps in the opposite direction, sort of like Assassin's Creed. It's great for quick movement around ledges in vertical levels. If the player does nothing within this jump window, it gives them another opportunity to make a decision. Immediately a ledge climb is completed, instead of going to the idle state by default, the game checks for multiple things. It first checks if the player pressed jump after the ledge climb window, kind of like impulse buffering thing. If they did, the player performs a jump immediately after the ledge climb. If no jump was pressed, it checks if the player is holding the forward button. If they are, Instead of transitioning to the idle state, it plays a special transition animation from ledge climb to run, and it maintains the X velocity of the player. The same thing also applies to other inputs like dash, block, and attack. So the player is always immediately able to perform these actions immediately after the ledge climb. All these checks are just to make sure that at every point during movements, the player is not stuck. There are always a variety of ways to get out of different situations. You have to note that adding all these multiple states and checks also means that I need a lot of transition animations between states, which I actually think is worth the work. Also, I try to reuse a lot of frames from other animation states for the transition, so it really doesn't take a lot of time to set up for me. Lastly, let's talk about how I set up my animations for these states and transitions. My animations are mostly data controlled, which means the actual animation length doesn't necessarily dictate how long it will play for. I usually set my duration variables in code to drive these animations. To make this work, many of my animations are broken down into 3 parts: the start, the loop, and the end. If the animation is needed to play for a longer duration, it simply plays the loop animation over again until it's close to the end, and then it plays the end animation. What this means is that I can always adjust duration of actions directly in code and not have to worry about changing the animation to match. I can also cancel a state's midpoint and transition to a new state without having to play the cancelled state end animation. Overall, I think my game has definitely improved this past month. Even though it's a lot of work, it's still work I enjoyed. My game is still in early development, and I'm looking for testers to help me solidify the core mechanics. If you are interested, join my Discord page and stay tuned for more information. That will be all for this devlog. Thanks for sticking around to the end. See you in the next one.